That night, I trembled in my own home, not because of the storm raging outside, but because of the way my father-in-law looked at me through the flickering light of the lamp. Not a word was spoken, but his eyes pierced through every layer of clothing I wore, as if he knew something about me that I hadn't yet dared to admit to myself. I had thought it would be an ordinary night, another lonely one like so many others when my husband was away. But no, it was the night when every limit within me was tested, where the line between right and wrong blurred until it was suffocating. And when he touched my hand, I knew that no man had ever made me feel this way, alive, vulnerable, and utterly exposed. Have you ever wondered what happens when someone steps into your life and changes everything in just a few fleeting hours? Let me tell you a story I'll never forget. My name is Alice. I was born in a small town nestled in the heart of Canada, where golden wheat fields stretched out like endless carpets, embracing dense, mysterious forests. My town didn't have a name on the big maps, but to me, it was the whole world. My family's wooden house sat on the edge of the village, a place where I woke each morning to the sound of birds chirping and the scent of freshly turned soil drifting through the cracked open window. In winter, smoke rose from our old chimney, mingling with the biting cold to form lazy white clouds against a gray sky. Our life was simple, almost harsh, but in that scarcity, I found a treasure no money could buy, the love of family. My father was a farmer, a man with hands as rough as aged oak bark, calloused from years of toil. He spoke little, perhaps not even 100 sentences in a year, but every action of his was a declaration. Before the sun rose, I'd see his hunched figure in the fields, his old worn jacket etched against the thick morning mist. He worked tirelessly, sometimes to the point of collapse, yet I never heard him complain. To him, the land wasn't just a livelihood, it was a promise he made to us, his children. And every evening, when he crossed the threshold with shoulders bowed from exhaustion, he'd still give me a smile, small, but enough to tell me that everything he did was for me, for my siblings, for a tomorrow he believed we deserved. My mother was his opposite. If my father was a steadfast rock, she was the warm breeze that blew through our lives. She was the soul of the village market, standing behind her stall with a smile as radiant as sunlight on a winter's day. Her hands moved deftly, arranging red apples, golden pears, and fragrant peaches into neat stacks like works of art. She had a gift for turning the ordinary into magic. A witty remark, a playful wink, and even the grumpiest customers would leave laughing. I'd stand beside her, watching her command that space, and wonder if I'd ever be as strong, as warm as she was. I grew up between those two worlds, my father's resilience and my mother's tenderness. My childhood days were mornings spent chasing my father through the fields, my small hands struggling to lift heavy bundles of wheat, sweat dripping down my forehead but my smile never fading. Then came afternoons with my mother at the market, learning to count change with cold coins, to smile at unfamiliar faces, and to hold on to hope even when rain poured and customers dwindled. Life wasn't easy. Some winters we had only potatoes to eat, some summers the scorching sun burned away all hope, but love and unity kept us standing. I thought that was all I needed to live a full life. Then, at 22, I met Rufus. He swept into my little town like a strange wind, tall, handsome, with a smile so bright it could melt winter ice. The first time I saw him, standing under an old oak tree with sunlight filtering through the leaves, my heart skipped a beat, then raced faster than ever. He wasn't just charming. He had a natural warmth, a humor that made everyone around him laugh even on the worst days. To me, he was fate. Just a few months later, we married in a simple ceremony overflowing with joy. Friends and family gathered under a clear blue sky, their smiles sparkling like sunlight through wine glasses. When Rufus took my hand and made his vows, I thought, this is love. This is the American dream I never dared to dream. Rufus's family welcomed me as one of their own. His mother, Clara, embraced me from the first day, calling me daughter in a voice as sweet as honey. She baked me apple pies, shared stories of Rufus's childhood, and I felt her love wrap around me like a warm blanket on cold winter days. But the one who left the deepest mark on me wasn't Clara, or even Rufus. It was his father, Mr. Adissa, a retired teacher with a quiet presence as steady as a mountain in a storm. The first time I met Mr. Adissa, I felt a strange energy. He wasn't the type to impress with grand words or gestures. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice rang like a church bell, deep, steady, and commanding. His eyes were what I couldn't forget, bottomless as a dark pool, yet not cold. They burned with a small flame, a warmth I'd never seen in anyone else. He had a way of making you feel both small and infinitely significant, as if every word you said was a precious gem he cherished. I remember one early afternoon sitting with him on the porch as the sun dipped low, painting the distant fields gold. He told me about his days teaching at a small school, facing rowdy classrooms armed with nothing but a chalkboard and his voice. They didn't need books, he said, his eyes glinting with mischief. They needed someone to believe they could do it. His stories weren't just memories, they were living lessons, wrapped in wit and profound wisdom. I sat there listening, and for the first time, I felt like more than just a wife. I was a student, uncovering the great truths of life. As time passed, I realized Mr. Adissa wasn't just my father-in-law. He was a friend, a teacher, and sometimes, a second father I hadn't known I needed. Being near him brought a strange sense of safety. Not the kind you get from locking your doors, but a safety of the soul, as if he could see the darkest corners of me and still choose to stay. Once, when I accidentally revealed my fears, that I wasn't good enough for Rufus, that I wasn't strong enough for this life, he didn't rush to comfort me with empty words. He simply placed his hand on my shoulder, a touch heavy with promise. "You're enough, Alice. You've always been enough." And in that moment, I believed him. Rufus grew busier with his trucking company. He was often away on trips, leaving me alone in the small house we'd built together in our early marriage days. I grew used to that loneliness, the ticking clock at night, the wind whistling through the cracks, my own footsteps echoing in the empty halls. I didn't resent Rufus, he was working for us, for our future, but sometimes I wondered if he truly saw me, or if I was just a piece of the perfect picture he'd painted. I never imagined that one lonely night, seemingly like any other, would become the night that turned everything I believed about myself upside down. That night started like all the others. Rufus left for California, giving me a quick kiss on the forehead and a promise to call when he arrived. I stood at the door, watching his truck disappear into the darkness, a familiar emptiness creeping into my chest. I shut the door, stepped into the kitchen, and tried to focus on cooking to chase away the chill creeping up my spine. But that night, something was different. The sky was pitch black, heavy clouds churning like they wanted to swallow the world whole. A clap of thunder shook the windows, and my heart beat faster, as if it knew something I didn't yet realize. The storm hit faster than I expected. Wind howled through the trees outside, sounding like the wail of a lost soul. Rain began to fall, fat drops pounding the roof like small stones, and each thunderclap startled me, as if the sky were shouting a warning I couldn't decipher. I stood in the kitchen, knife in hand, chopping vegetables, trying to keep my breathing steady. The smell of garlic and spices filled the air, the overhead light casting a faint yellow glow, but it wasn't enough to dispel the growing unease in my chest. I told myself, "It's just a storm, Alice. You've been through hundreds like this." But deep down, I knew this wasn't just any storm. Then, amidst the howling wind and relentless rain, a knock rang out, sharp, deliberate, cutting through the night like a blade. My heart pounded, my hands shook so hard the knife clattered onto the cutting board. Who would come at this hour, in a storm like this? I stood frozen, breath ragged, my mind racing with wild thoughts. Was it Rufus, back because he forgot something? Or a stranger lost in the chaos? I moved to the door, each step heavy as lead, and when I touched the knob, a chill shot up my spine. I took a deep breath and opened it. There, under the torrential rain, stood Mr. Adissa, my father-in-law. His clothes clung to him, soaked through like a second skin, his hair matted with water, and rain streaked down his face like endless tears. But what stunned me wasn't his appearance, it was the eerie calm on his face. Amid that raging storm, he stood like an unyielding lighthouse, untouched by panic or fear. "Papa!" I gasped, my voice breaking with surprise. He gave a small, warm smile, a flicker of light in the dark. "My car broke down on the way home," he said, his voice steady as if recounting something mundane. "The rain started, and I figured I'd better take shelter here." I hurriedly welcomed him in, a mix of relief and confusion swirling inside me. He stepped over the threshold, bringing the storm's chill with him, but also a presence that made the house feel alive. "Papa, you're soaked," I said, trying to steady my voice despite my racing pulse. "Let me get a towel and make you some hot tea." He nodded, his eyes flicking over me briefly, not probing, but as if reading a book only he understood. I rushed to grab a towel, leaving him in the entryway to peel off his wet shoes. When I returned, he'd shed his coat, water pooling on the floor in small puddles, and I noticed he looked more tired than usual, a weariness not just from the storm, but from something deeper. "Come to the living room, Papa," I said, leading him to the warm space where the fireplace crackled. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the rugged lines etched with life. "Sit down, I'll make tea." He waved a hand. "No need to fuss, child. You've done enough." But I insisted. "It's no trouble. You need to warm up." I turned back to the kitchen, but couldn't help glancing at him from the corner of my eye. He sat there, quietly watching the flames, and for the first time, I felt the loneliness in this house melt away. But with it came something else, a strange tension, as if I were standing on the edge of something I wasn't ready to face. When I brought out the steaming tea, he took it with hands trembling slightly from the cold. We sat there, saying little, the rain roaring outside and the fire snapping within. But that silence wasn't empty, it was thick with an understanding I'd never known. I looked at him, and for the first time, I wondered, who was he really beyond being Rufus's father? A man who'd lived so many years, seen so many stories, and now sat here with me in the darkest night. I wanted to ask him something. Anything, but my throat tightened, as if words couldn't capture what I felt. Then, like a knife through the night, the lights went out. The storm had cut the power. I jolted, my heart pounding, and in that instant, darkness enveloped me like a suffocating embrace. Only the flickering firelight and occasional lightning flashes lit the room in brief, eerie bursts. I stumbled to my feet, fumbling into the kitchen for an old camping lantern Rufus once used. When I returned, its faint glow illuminated Mr. Odysseus' face. He looked at me, his eyes deep and piercing, and a jolt ran through me. Not fear, but something strange, as if he were gazing straight into my soul, stripping away every shield I'd built to hide myself. "Papa, you should change into dry clothes," I said, my voice shaky, unsure if it was from the cold or something else. "You'll get sick." He shook his head slightly. "No need, child. I'm fine." But I wouldn't listen. I dashed to the bedroom, digging out Rufus's clothes, a loose grey sweater and warm flannel pants he wore on cold days at home. When I handed them to him, my fingers brushed his. It was just a fleeting touch, but it sparked like lightning, freezing me in place. He looked at me, saying nothing, but those eyes, oh those eyes, whispered something I didn't dare comprehend, didn't dare face. He stood, taking the clothes to the bathroom to change. I returned to the kitchen, stirring the soup I'd started earlier, trying to focus on the warm scent of spices to drown out the strange feeling swelling inside me. The rain still hammered the roof, a chaotic symphony with no end. When Mr. Odysseus returned, wearing Rufus's slightly oversized sweater, he looked both foreign and familiar. The sweater sagged at his shoulders, revealing a lean but sturdy neck, and I realized that though age had marked his body, a fierce vitality still smoldered within him. "Feel better, Papa?" I asked, forcing a smile to mask my unease. "Much," he replied, his voice soft but weighted with meaning. We sat down, and I brought out 2 bowls of hot soup to the living room. We ate in silence, the clink of spoons against bowls and the relentless rain the only sounds. But in that quiet, I sensed something greater, a connection I couldn't name. The lantern's light danced on the walls, casting strange shadows, and I began to feel we weren't just 2 people sitting there, but 2 souls finding each other in a chaotic world. I wanted to speak, to break the silence, but each time I tried, my words caught, as if anything I said would shatter this moment. Then, as if the storm wanted to test us further, a loud crash echoed from afar. Maybe a tree falling or a power line struck by lightning. I flinched, dropping my spoon to the floor with a sharp clang. Mr. Odysseus calmly rose, picked it up for me, and as he handed it back, his hand brushed mine again. This time, he didn't let go right away. He held it, just for a moment, but it was enough to make my heart race like a caged bird flapping desperately. "Are you all right, Alice?" he asked, his voice low like waves on a shore, but laced with a tenderness I'd never heard before. I nodded, but inside, I knew I wasn't all right. Not at all. I stood, fleeing the living room, my heart pounding as if it might burst from my chest. I slipped into the bedroom, shut the door, and stood before the wardrobe in the dark. I didn't know why, but I felt the need to change, to do something to prove I was still me, still in control of the chaos swirling within. I chose a red dress, the one I'd worn on a special night with Rufus, when he'd looked at me like I was his entire world. It hugged my curves perfectly, accentuating lines I usually hid. I added gold earrings and a delicate necklace, then spritzed on some perfume, a gentle floral scent that filled the air. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize myself. I looked stronger, more alive, but also more vulnerable than ever. I took a deep breath and stepped out. When Mr. Adissa saw me, his eyes froze, widening for a moment before a slow smile spread across his lips. "You look stunning," he said, his voice soft but heavy, each word chosen with care. My cheeks burned, my heart raced faster, and for a moment, time stood still. He rose, stepping closer, each footfall making the air between us hum. He didn't touch me, but his presence was so near I could feel his warmth, an invisible flame spreading across my skin. That night, in the dim glow of the lantern and firelight, I felt something no man had ever given me, not even Rufus. Mr. Adissa didn't just look at me, he saw me. He saw the scars I hid beneath my confident shell, the dreams I'd buried since childhood, the fears I wouldn't face even in my longest nights. When he took my hand, leading me back to the living room, I felt like I was stepping into another world. A place where I wasn't just Rufus's wife or my parents' daughter, but Alice, whole, alive, and valued beyond anything I'd ever imagined. We sat closer than I'd thought possible, but nothing crossed a line. It wasn't temptation or wrongdoing, it was understanding, a familial love in a form so profound I'd never known. He told me about his youth, the times he'd felt lost in life, the nights he'd stood alone under a starry sky wondering if he truly belonged anywhere. I listened, realizing he wasn't just sharing his story. He was giving me a piece of himself, an invisible gift heavy with meaning. In that moment, I no longer felt alone. I felt I belonged, not just to Rufus, not just to my family, but to him, to myself. As the storm faded, the first light of morning slipped through the window cracks, illuminating Mr. Adissa's face. He looked weary but at peace, as if that night had changed him as much as it had me. He stood, placing his hand on my shoulder once more, a touch now familiar, like a wordless goodbye. "Thank you, Alice," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Thank you for giving me a place to shelter." I smiled, but in my heart, I knew I was the one who should be grateful. He left as the sun rose, leaving me standing there, watching his figure fade into the morning mist. But what he left in me never faded. That night wasn't just a memory. It became a part of me, a mark carved deep in my soul that time can't erase. No man had ever made me feel that way, seen, loved, and fully alive in every breath. I stood in the now silent house, and for the first time, I felt I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Mr. Adissa had given me a gift I'd carry forever. Not love in the usual sense, but the recognition that I, Alice, was enough. And I knew that no matter where life took me, I'd always carry his gaze, his touch, and his presence, the man who changed me forever. And that's my story, a night that reshaped who I am and how I see the world. If this tale of storms, connection, and transformation touched you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it too. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. I've got plenty more to tell, and I'd love for you to join me on this journey. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had a moment that changed everything? I'll see you in the next video. Until then, stay warm, stay true, and take care.